the woman who stepped off the westbound train in Silver Reef, Utah. That scorching afternoon in July of 1878 looked like she had been dragged through every mile between Missouri and the Utah Territory, and the dozen men waiting on the platform took one collective look at her before turning away in visible disappointment. Josephine Taylor stood there with her single battered trunk at her feet, her plain brown traveling dress torn at the hem and stained with soot, her mousy hair escaping its pins in wild tangles, and a purple bruise blooming across her left cheekbone that she had not bothered to powder over. She was 23 years old, bone-thin from weeks of sparse eating, and possessed none of the dewy-cheeked charm that mail-order brides were supposed to bring west with them. The man who had paid her train fare, a mine foreman named Robert Hutchins, pushed through the disappointed crowd and stopped 3 feet from her, his face turning an unhealthy shade of red. "You are not what was promised," he said flatly, his voice carrying across the platform. "The agency sent me a photograph of a beauty, not some half-starved scarecrow with a face like she just lost a brawl." Josephine lifted her chin, though her hands trembled at her sides. "The photograph was 4 years old, taken before my parents died and I lost everything," she said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her chest. "I wrote to the agency explaining my circumstances. I was told it would not matter, that Western men valued character over appearances. Then you were lied to." Hutchins pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and thrust it toward her. "Here is enough money for a week at the boarding house. After that, you are on your own. I will be writing to the agency demanding my money back." He turned on his heel and strode away, and the other men followed him like a retreating tide, leaving Josephine alone on the platform with the station master eyeing her with poorly concealed pity. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the Utah sun beating down on her head and the weight of her failure pressing against her ribs. She had sold everything she owned to pay the agency fees, had endured 3 weeks of brutal travel, had pinned every desperate hope on the promise of a new life in the West. Now she had $12, a trunk full of worn clothing, and nowhere to go except back to the St. Louis tenement where she would likely starve before winter came. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep and surprisingly gentle, and Josephine turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. His clothes were dusty but well-made, the clothes of a working rancher rather than a drifter, and his eyes were the color of sage honey in the afternoon light. "I could not help but overhear that unfortunate exchange. I am sorry for how you were treated." "Thank you," Josephine said stiffly, bracing herself for whatever pity or propositions might follow. She had learned in the past year that kindness from strange men usually came with strings attached, but the man simply shifted his weight and said, "My name is Graham Reeves. I own a ranch about 8 miles north of town, up in the hills where the grazing is still decent. I came into Silver Reef today to pick up supplies and to see if any of the mining operations had horses for sale." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I also came because I heard there was a bride arriving, and I have been thinking for some time that a ranch is a lonely place for one person to manage alone." Josephine's throat tightened. "Did you see what just happened? I am not the bride anyone wants, Mr. Reeves. I am not pretty or accomplished, and I have no dowry or prospects. I am exactly what that man called me, a half-starved scarecrow with nothing to recommend her." Graham Reeves looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "I saw a woman who traveled 3 weeks across dangerous country to make a new life for herself," he said quietly. I saw someone who stood up straight when she was being insulted in public, who did not cry or beg or make excuses. I saw courage, miss, and that is worth more than a pretty face or a fat dowry. He turned his hat in his hands. If you are interested, I would like to offer you what Hutchins should have. A home, a partnership, and respect. I will not lie and say I am offering romance or fine living. The ranch is small and the work is hard, and I am not a sophisticated man. But I am honest. I do not drink to excess or raise my hand in anger, and I keep my word once it is given. Josephine stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or hidden cruelty, but found only sincerity in those steady eyes. You do not even know me, she whispered. That is true, he acknowledged. But I know what it is like to be judged unfairly, and I know that the things that matter in a partnership are not the things that show in a photograph. If you are willing, we could spend some time getting acquainted. I need to be in town for 2 more days completing my business. You could stay at the boarding house, and we could take meals together and talk. At the end of that time, if you decide you want to take the chance, we could be married and head up to the ranch. If you decide you would rather try your luck elsewhere, I will give you enough money to get yourself settled somewhere else with no obligations. He met her eyes directly. I am not offering charity, Miss Taylor. I genuinely believe you might be exactly who I have been seeking, even if no one else sees it. The words hit her like a physical blow, kind and unexpected. And for the first time since her parents had died in the cholera outbreak that swept through St. Louis, Josephine felt something other than desperation and grief. She looked at Graham Reeves, really looked at him, and saw calloused hands that spoke of honest work, a face that was more weathered than handsome but held no cruelty, and a posture that suggested patience rather than urgency. He was offering her a choice, not making demands, and that alone was more than anyone had given her in months. I would like that, she heard herself say. I would like to spend 2 days getting acquainted, Mr. Reeves, and see if we might suit each other. The smile that crossed his face was brief but genuine, transforming his rather serious features into something warmer. Then let me carry your trunk to the boarding house, he said, already bending to lift it. Mrs. Henderson runs a decent establishment and her rates are fair. Once you are settled, perhaps you would join me for supper. Nothing fancy, just the hotel dining room, but the food is good and we could talk. Josephine nodded, and as she walked beside him down the dusty main street of Silver Reef, she felt the first small flutter of something that might have been hope. The boarding house was a neat 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, and Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump woman in her 50s with shrewd but not unkind eyes. She looked Josephine over with the same assessing gaze that every other person in town had used, but her expression softened when Graham said quietly, Miss Taylor has had a difficult journey, Mrs. Henderson. I would appreciate it if you could give her your best available room and perhaps draw her a bath. I will cover the expenses for the week. The best room it is, Mrs. Henderson said briskly, accepting the money Graham counted out. Come along, dear. You look like you could use some rest before supper. She led Josephine upstairs to a clean, simple room with a real bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. That Graham Reeves is a good man, she added as she helped Josephine drag her trunk inside. Lost his parents to a wagon accident 5 years back and has been running that ranch by himself ever since. Works harder than 3 men put together, and he is honest as the day is long. If he is showing interest in you, you could do far worse. He seems very kind, Josephine said carefully, not wanting to presume too much. Kind, yes, but not soft, Mrs. Henderson said. He will expect a partner who can pull her weight, not a delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of hardship. But I suspect you know something about hardship already, do you not? Her eyes went to the bruise on Josephine's cheek. I got that bruise breaking up a fight in the boarding house where I was staying in St. Louis, Josephine said, meeting the older woman's gaze steadily. A drunk man was beating his wife and I hit him with a fire poker. He backhanded me for my trouble, but his wife got away, and that was what mattered. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted to something like approval. Well then, she said with satisfaction. I will have that bath drawn for you right away, and you take your time getting cleaned up. Graham said he would call for you at 6 for supper, so you have a few hours to rest. After Mrs. Henderson left, Josephine sank down on the edge of the bed and let herself absorb what had just happened. She had been rejected, humiliated, and then offered an unexpected lifeline all in the space of an hour. Graham Reeves was a stranger, and she would be a fool to trust him completely based on one conversation. But something in his steady manner and direct speech made her want to believe he was exactly what he appeared to be. She opened her trunk and sorted through its meager contents, looking for something suitable to wear to supper. Most of her dresses were as worn and stained as the one she had traveled in, but at the bottom of the trunk, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was the one good dress she had kept from her old life. It was a simple design in deep blue cotton, with a fitted bodice and clean lines that did not require a bustle or excessive petticoats. She had worn it to church socials before her world fell apart, and it still fit her thinner frame reasonably well. When the bath was ready, she sank into the hot water with a groan of relief and scrubbed away 3 weeks of train soot and dust. She washed her hair twice, working out the tangles with patient fingers, and then sat in the cooling water and tried to think practically about her situation. Graham Reeves was offering her marriage and a home, but she knew from her mother's cautionary tales that marriage could be heaven or hell depending on the man involved. She needed to use these 2 days to learn as much as possible about his character, his expectations, and whether she could truly see herself spending a lifetime on an isolated ranch with him. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, Josephine was dressed in the blue dress with her hair pinned up in a simple style that kept it off her face. The bruise was still visible, purple and ugly against her pale skin, but she refused to hide in shame for defending someone who needed help. She had just finished pinning on her mother's cameo brooch when Mrs. Henderson called up the stairs that her guest had arrived. Graham was waiting in the boarding house parlor, and he had clearly made an effort as well, changing into clean dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, like a man more used to working gear, but his face lit up when he saw Josephine descending the stairs. "You look lovely," he said simply, offering his arm. "Shall we go? The hotel dining room fills up quickly on Saturday nights." They walked the 3 blocks to the Silver Reef Hotel in companionable silence, and Josephine found herself acutely aware of the curious stares from townspeople who had clearly already heard about the rejected bride and were now speculating about her appearance with Graham Reeves. She kept her head high and her hand steady on Graham's arm, refusing to show any embarrassment. The hotel dining room was indeed crowded, full of miners and merchants and a few families, but the hostess found them a table near the window that offered some privacy from the general noise. Graham held Josephine's chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy, then settled across from her and studied the handwritten menu board on the wall. "The beef stew is always good," he said, "and they make decent biscuits, but order whatever appeals to you. I am buying." They ordered the stew, and once the waitress had brought them coffee, Graham folded his hands on the table and said, "I think we should be honest with each other about what we are looking for. I will go first, if that is acceptable. Josephine nodded, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. I am 26 years old, Graham began. I was born in Missouri but came west with my parents when I was 12. My father bought the ranch from a man who was giving up and heading back east, and we spent years building it up from barely surviving to actually profitable. 5 years ago, my parents were killed when their wagon overturned in a flash flood. I have been running the ranch alone since then, with occasional help from hired hands during roundup season. He paused to sip his coffee. The ranch is not large by Montana or Wyoming standards, but it is good land with reliable water sources. I run about 300 head of cattle and a small horse herd. The house is solid, built from stone and timber, with 2 bedrooms and a main room that serves as kitchen and living space. There is no fancy furniture or decoration, but it is weatherproof and comfortable enough. He met her eyes across the table. I am looking for a partner, Miss Taylor. Someone who can help with the ranch work when needed, who can manage the household, and who I can build a life with. I will not lie and say I am looking for some grand romantic love story. I am practical enough to know that respect and partnership can grow into something deeper over time, but I need someone who is strong enough to handle the isolation and the work. The nearest neighbors are 4 miles away, and town is a 2-hour ride. It can be lonely, especially in winter, and there are real dangers from weather, animals, and occasionally from men with bad intentions. The waitress brought their food, and Graham waited until she had left before continuing. What I can offer in return is a home, financial security within reason, respect for your opinions and contributions, and loyalty. I do not gamble. I do not drink beyond the occasional whiskey, and I believe in keeping my word. I also believe that a wife is a partner, not property, and should have a say in decisions that affect the household. He picked up his fork but did not start eating yet. That is my situation and my offer. Now I would like to hear about you if you are willing to share. Josephine took a breath and organized her thoughts. I am 23 years old, born and raised in St. Louis. My father was a bookkeeper and my mother was a seamstress, and we lived modestly but comfortably. They both died in the cholera outbreak last year within 3 days of each other. I had no other family, and the debts from their medical care took everything we owned. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. I tried to find work, but positions for respectable women are scarce, and the wages barely covered rent in the tenement where I moved. I was facing eviction when I saw an advertisement for the mail-order bride agency. I sold my mother's wedding ring to pay the fees and used the rest for train fare. She looked down at her bowl, stirring the stew without eating. I am not accomplished in the ways that wealthy women are. I cannot play piano or paint watercolors or speak French, but I can read and write and do figures. I can sew well enough to make and mend clothes. I can cook plain food that will stick to a person's ribs. I know how to preserve vegetables and fruits, and I can manage a household budget. I am not afraid of hard work, and I am stronger than I look despite being thin right now. She glanced up at him. What I am looking for is simple, Mr. Reeves. I want a home where I am not terrified of being thrown out on the street. I want to be useful and to build something that matters. I do not need luxury or excitement. I need stability and respect, and the chance to prove that I am worth more than my appearance. She touched the bruise on her cheek unconsciously. I have a temper when I see injustice, and I do not back down from fights I believe are right. That has gotten me into trouble before, and it probably will again. I am telling you this because you deserve to know what you would be getting. Graham had started eating during her speech, and now he swallowed a bite of stew and looked at her with something like approval. A temper in defense of what is right is not a flaw, Miss Taylor. That is called courage, and it is a quality I value." He gestured at her untouched food. "Please eat. You need it, and there is no judgment here." Josephine realized she was ravenous and dug into the stew, which was rich and savory and better than anything she had eaten in weeks. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and then Graham said, "Tell me about your parents. What were they like?" The question surprised her, and she found herself talking about her father's dry sense of humor and her mother's skill with a needle, about Sunday dinners and winter evenings spent reading aloud by the fire. Graham listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, and then he shared stories about his own parents, about his mother's terrible singing voice and his father's stubborn insistence on trying to grow corn in Utah soil that was better suited to grazing. By the time they finished eating, the tension in Josephine's shoulders had eased, and she found herself almost enjoying the conversation. Graham was not a talkative man by nature, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He did not try to impress her with exaggerations or fill every silence with nervous chatter. Instead, he seemed content to let the conversation flow naturally, and Josephine appreciated his calm presence. After supper, they walked slowly back toward the boarding house, taking a longer route that led past the church and the schoolhouse. The evening air was cooling, bringing relief from the day's heat, and the sky was beginning to turn pink and gold with the sunset. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Graham said as they walked. "Would you like to attend church services? It would give you a chance to meet some of the townspeople in a neutral setting, and afterwards we could take a picnic lunch up to the hills so you can see the kind of country the ranch is in. I know you need to make an informed decision, and that includes understanding what the land is like." "I would like that," Josephine said. "Both the church and the picnic. I want to understand what my life would be like if I accept your offer." They had reached the boarding house, and Graham stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Miss Taylor, I want to be clear about something. If you decide at the end of these 2 days that this is not right for you, there will be no hard feelings and no conditions on the money I give you to get settled elsewhere. You are not obligated to me simply because I bought you supper and offered you a choice." Josephine looked at him in the fading light and felt something shift in her chest, a tiny crack in the walls she had built around her heart. "Thank you for that, Mr. Reeves, and thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Graham," he said quietly, "if we are considering marriage, you should call me Graham. And I do see you, Josephine. I see someone brave and honest and stronger than she knows. That is exactly what I have been seeking, even if I did not know it until today." He tipped his hat to her and walked away into the gathering dusk, leaving Josephine standing on the porch with her heart beating faster than it had in months. She went inside and climbed the stairs to her room, and for the first time since her parents died, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something other than fear and struggle. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, and Josephine dressed carefully in her blue dress again, wishing she had something more suitable for church, but making do with what she had. She pinned her hair up neatly and tied on her worn straw bonnet, then went downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson setting out a simple breakfast of biscuits and jam. "You look presentable," the older woman said with approval. "Graham Reeves came by early this morning and left money to cover your meals while you are here. He also left you this." She handed Josephine a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a beautiful paisley shawl in shades of blue and cream, soft wool that would be perfect for cool evenings. Tucked into the folds was a note in neat, strong handwriting that read, "I noticed you did not have a shawl yesterday. Thought you might need one. Graham." Josephine held the shawl against her chest, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the gesture. It was not flashy or expensive, but it was practical and thoughtful, chosen because he had noticed she might need it. She draped it around her shoulders and went out to meet Graham, who was waiting by his wagon, which he had clearly washed that morning because the dust was gone and the horses were groomed until they gleamed. "Thank you for the shawl," she said as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "It is lovely." "It suits you," he said simply, and they rode to the church in comfortable silence. The Silver Reef Community Church was a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and plain glass windows, and it was already filling with townspeople when they arrived. Josephine felt the weight of curious stares as Graham escorted her inside and found them seats near the back, but he seemed oblivious to the attention, settling beside her with his hat in his lap and his expression calm. The service was straightforward, led by a traveling circuit preacher who spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan and the importance of seeing worth in those whom others overlooked. Josephine found herself listening intently, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar rhythms of hymns and scripture readings. Beside her, Graham had a pleasant baritone that blended well with the congregation's singing, and she caught herself glancing at him more than once, studying the strong line of his jaw and the gentle way his hands held the hymnal. After the service, several people approached to introduce themselves. Most were cordial if reserved, clearly waiting to see what would become of the situation before committing to friendship, but a few were genuinely warm. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, hugely pregnant and accompanied by her minor husband, squeezed Josephine's hand and whispered, "Do not let anyone make you feel less than you are. This town needs more women with backbone." They collected the picnic basket Graham had left in the wagon and drove north out of town, climbing into the red rock hills that rose beyond Silver Reef. The landscape was dramatic and strange to Josephine's eyes, all sandstone formations and scrubby vegetation, so different from the green Missouri of her childhood. Graham pointed out landmarks as they drove, explaining the geography and the challenges of ranching in this arid country. "Water is the key to everything here," he said as they followed a rough track along a ridgeline. "The ranch has 3 reliable springs and a creek that runs year-round, which is why my father bought it. Without water, the land is worthless for grazing. But with it, we can support cattle and horses, and even grow some vegetables in irrigated gardens." They stopped in a meadow that overlooked a vast sweep of red and gold landscape, with distant purple mountains on the horizon. Graham spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree and unpacked the basket, which contained fried chicken, bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of lemonade packed in damp cloths to keep it cool. As they ate, Josephine asked the questions that had been building in her mind. What would my days be like if I came to live at the ranch? What would you expect from me? Graham considered the question while he finished a piece of chicken. The daily work varies by season, but there are constants. Cooking, of course, and keeping the house clean. Tending the vegetable garden in summer. Preserving food for winter. Mending clothes and gear. Feeding the chickens and collecting eggs. I have a milk cow that needs tending twice a day." He paused. "During busy seasons like calving or roundup, I would need help with the cattle work. That can mean long days in the saddle, getting dirty and tired, and sometimes dealing with difficult situations. Can you ride?" "I learned as a child, but it has been years," Josephine admitted. "I would need practice." "That can be taught," Graham said. "The main question is whether you would be willing to do that kind of work when needed. A lot of women would rather stay in the house, and I understand that, but on a ranch this size, I cannot afford to hire a full-time hand and also support a wife who cannot or will not help with the outdoor work." "I am willing," Josephine said firmly. I would rather be useful than decorative, and I am not afraid of cattle or horses. I might be afraid of being useless, though, of being a burden rather than a partner." Graham looked at her with those steady eyes. "You would not be a burden, Josephine. Even if you only handled the household work, that would free me to focus on the ranch work without having to stop and cook meals or wonder if my clothes will be mended. But knowing you are willing to do more than that, knowing you see this as a true partnership, that means a great deal." They talked for hours, sitting in the shade of the cottonwood while the afternoon wore on. Graham told her about the challenges of ranching, about droughts and harsh winters, about dealing with rustlers and predators, and the constant threat of financial ruin if the cattle market crashed. Josephine talked about her fears and hopes, about the nightmare of her parents' deaths and the desperate months that followed, about her determination to never be that helpless and afraid again. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Graham packed up the picnic basket and said, "I want to show you something before we head back to town." He drove the wagon further into the hills, following a track that was barely visible, until they reached a promontory that overlooked a green valley with a stone house nestled against a hillside. "That is the ranch," he said quietly. "My home. Potentially our home if you decide you want it." Josephine stood up in the wagon for a better view. The house looked solid and well-maintained, with smoke rising from the chimney and horses grazing in a nearby corral. Beyond it, she could see cattle scattered across the valley floor, and the creek Graham had mentioned, a silver ribbon winding through the grass. It was isolated and undeniably remote, but there was something appealing about the tidy ranch and the beautiful valley, something that spoke to her bone-deep need for security and permanence. "It looks like a good home," she said softly. "It looks like a place worth fighting for." "It is," Graham said. "I have put 5 years of sweat and blood into keeping it going after my parents died. I am not rich, and I probably never will be, but the ranch is mine free and clear, and it provides a decent living. It could provide for a family if I had one." The unspoken question hung in the air between them, but Graham did not push. He simply drove her back to town as the stars began to appear, and when he left her at the boarding house, he said, "Tomorrow is my last day in town. I need to pick up my supply order from the general store and meet with the banker about a small loan to expand the horse herd. If you would like, you could come with me and see how I conduct business. Then tomorrow evening, we could talk about whether you want to move forward with this arrangement." Josephine agreed and spent that night lying awake in the boarding house bed, weighing her options. She could accept Graham's offer, marry a man she had known for only 2 days, and move to an isolated ranch where she would work hard every day for the rest of her life. Or she could take his offered money and try to make her own way in Silver Reef or some other town, finding work as a seamstress or laundress or cook, always one financial disaster away from destitution. When she examined her choices honestly, the decision was not as difficult as it should have been. Graham Reeves had shown her more genuine respect and kindness in 2 days than most people had shown her in the past year. He was honest about what he could offer and what he expected in return. He did not promise romance or easy living, but he offered partnership and security, and those were things she desperately needed. More than that, she found herself drawn to his quiet strength and his direct way of speaking. She liked how he listened when she talked, how he did not dismiss her opinions or try to manage her feelings. She could imagine building a life with him, working side by side to make the ranch prosper, and that vision held more appeal than the endless struggle of trying to survive alone. By morning, she had made her decision, though she wanted to wait for the evening as Graham had suggested to make it official. Monday was busy and enlightening. Graham took her to the general store, where he methodically worked through a written list of supplies, negotiating prices with the store owner and making careful notes in a ledger about what he spent. Josephine noticed that he was frugal but not cheap, buying good quality items that would last rather than the cheapest options. At the bank, he discussed his finances with a straightforward competence that impressed her, explaining his plans for expanding his breeding stock and showing the banker detailed records of the ranch's productivity over the past 3 years. Between errands, they stopped at the hotel for lunch, and Graham introduced her to several acquaintances who were in town for business. He never made excuses for her or apologized for her appearance, simply introduced her as Miss Josephine Taylor and let her speak for herself. Josephine found herself relaxing under his steady support, and she noticed that people responded well to his quiet confidence. As evening approached, Graham suggested they walk out to the edge of town, where there was a small park with a few trees and benches. They sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson, and finally Graham turned to her and said, "I think you know what I am going to ask, Josephine, but I want to do this properly." He took her hand gently, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I believe we could build a good life together. I believe we could become true partners and maybe more than that over time. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Josephine looked at their joined hands at this man who had seen value in her when no one else did, and felt that crack in her heart widen into something that might eventually become love. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, I will marry you, Graham. I believe we could build something worth having, and I want to try." The smile that crossed Graham's face was brilliant, transforming him from merely decent-looking to genuinely handsome. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with old-fashioned gallantry. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I promise I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this decision." They were married the next morning by the circuit preacher in a simple ceremony at the church, with Mrs. Henderson and the storekeeper standing as witnesses. Josephine wore her blue dress and Graham's shawl, and Graham wore his Sunday best with his dark hair slicked back and his boots polished. The ceremony was brief and dignified, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Graham kissed her gently on the forehead, a chaste gesture that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through Josephine's chest. After the ceremony, Graham had one more errand to run. He took Josephine to the seamstress shop and said, "I want you to order 2 new dresses made in practical fabrics that will hold up to ranch work, and also a split riding skirt so you can work with the horses safely. Mrs. Chen here does excellent work, and she will have them ready in 2 weeks. We will come back to town then to pick them up and get more supplies." Josephine tried to protest the expense, but Graham was firm. "You are my wife now, and you need proper clothing for the work we will be doing. This is not extravagance, it is practical necessity." Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman whose family had come to work on the Transcontinental Railroad and stayed, measured Josephine carefully and showed her fabric samples in sturdy cotton and wool. They selected patterns together, and Josephine found herself excited at the prospect of new clothes that actually fit properly and were designed for her new life. By early afternoon, they were finally ready to leave Silver Reef. Graham's wagon was loaded with supplies, and he helped Josephine up onto the seat beside him, then clicked to the horses and started the 8-mile journey to the ranch. Josephine looked back once at the town that had seen her rejected and then unexpectedly claimed, and then turned her face forward toward her new home. The ride took 2 hours, following rough tracks through increasingly wild country. Graham pointed out landmarks and explained the boundaries of his land, which stretched across several sections of valley and hillside. As they descended into the valley Josephine had seen from the promontory, she got her first close look at the house that would be her home. It was larger than she had expected, built from red sandstone blocks with a solid timber roof and a wide porch across the front. There were real glass windows, multiple outbuildings including a barn and chicken coop, and the vegetable garden Graham had mentioned, currently overgrown with weeds but showing signs of past cultivation. Graham pulled the wagon up to the house and said, "I am sorry about the state of things. It has been just me for a while, and I have focused more on the livestock than the house. But the structure is sound, and we can make improvements as we go." He helped her down from the wagon and led her inside, and Josephine stepped into what would be her home with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. The main room was spacious, with a large stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a good iron stove, and sturdy furniture that was plain but well made. Everything was dusty and cluttered with the debris of bachelor living, but the bones of the house were good. Graham showed her the 2 bedrooms, and Josephine noticed that he had already moved his belongings into the smaller one, leaving the larger bedroom with the better light and more space for her. The gesture touched her deeply. "I thought we should take some time to get to know each other before sharing a bedroom," Graham said, a faint blush coloring his weathered cheeks. "I meant what I said about partnership and respect, and that includes not rushing you into intimacy before you are ready. We are married legally, but we can take the rest at whatever pace you need." Josephine felt something loosen in her chest, a fear she had not fully acknowledged until it was addressed. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the wagon and beginning the process of settling in. Graham showed Josephine where everything was stored, introduced her to the milk cow and chickens, and explained the daily routines. He was patient and thorough, never making her feel stupid for asking questions, and Josephine found herself absorbing the information eagerly. For supper, she cooked her first meal in her new home, a simple stew from dried beef and vegetables, and they ate together at the kitchen table while Graham told her more about the ranch's history and his plans for the future. After supper, they washed dishes together in companionable silence and then sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Utah sky. "Are you nervous?" Graham asked quietly. "About all of this?" "Terrified," Josephine admitted. "But also hopeful, which is more than I have felt in a long time. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for you to turn out to be different than you seem, but so far you have been nothing but kind and honest." "I will make mistakes," Graham said. "I have a temper when things go wrong with the ranch, and I can be stubborn about doing things my own way. I tend to work too hard and forget to stop and rest. But I will never lie to you, and I will never raise my hand to you, and I will always respect your right to your own thoughts and feelings." They sat together in the darkness, not touching but close enough to feel each other's presence, and Josephine felt the first real stirrings of peace she had known since her parents died. The next weeks fell into a pattern that was exhausting but deeply satisfying. Josephine threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life, rising before dawn to milk the cow and feed the chickens, then preparing breakfast for herself and Graham before he headed out to work with the cattle. She spent her days cleaning and organizing the house, weeding and replanting the vegetable garden, mending clothes and gear, and learning to bake bread in the temperamental oven. Graham was endlessly patient with her questions and mistakes, showing her how to properly churn butter, how to identify poisonous plants from edible ones, how to tell when a chicken was sick and needed treatment. In the evenings, he began teaching her to ride again, starting her on his gentlest horse and working with her until she regained her childhood confidence in the saddle. Slowly, the house began to transform under Josephine's care. The windows were cleaned until they sparkled, curtains were sewn from fabric Graham brought back from town, and the clutter was organized into neat order. The vegetable garden flourished under her attention, producing tomatoes and squash and beans that she preserved for winter. She baked bread 3 times a week, and the smell of it filled the house with warmth and comfort. Graham noticed every improvement, thanking her sincerely for her efforts and often helping with the heavier work. He rebuilt the chicken coop to make it more secure, repaired the porch steps where they had begun to rot, and surprised her one evening by installing shelves in the kitchen exactly where she had mentioned wanting them. They were building something together, Josephine realized. Not just maintaining a ranch but creating a true home, and the partnership Graham had promised was becoming real in small daily actions and considerations. 6 weeks after their wedding, Graham woke Josephine before dawn and said, "I need to move the cattle to the higher pastures today before the summer heat gets too intense. It is a 2-day job, and I could use help if you feel ready for it. But it will be hard riding and camping rough. If you would rather stay here and tend the place, I understand." Josephine sat up, her hair tumbling around her shoulders, and met his eyes in the pre-dawn darkness. "I want to help," she said firmly. "That is why I am here, to be a partner. Tell me what I need to bring." Graham's smile was warm with approval and something deeper, something that made Josephine's heart beat faster. "Dress in your oldest clothes and the riding skirt Mrs. Chen made. Bring a bedroll and extra socks. I will pack food and gear." 2 hours later, they rode out together with the sun just breaking over the eastern horizon. Graham had 3 dogs who helped manage the cattle, experienced working animals who responded to his whistled commands. Josephine rode beside him as they gathered the scattered herd, and she found herself thrilling to the work despite the heat and dust. There was something primal and deeply satisfying about moving the cattle through the landscape, about working in perfect coordination with Graham and the dogs to guide 300 animals toward the higher pastures. By the time they stopped for a brief lunch, Josephine was already exhausted, her thighs aching from hours in the saddle and her face burning from the sun despite her bonnet. But she refused to complain, eating her bread and dried meat while standing because sitting down might mean not being able to get back up. Graham noticed her discomfort and said gently, "You are doing beautifully. Most women would have quit by now, but you are keeping up with work that seasoned cowboys find challenging. I am proud of you." The praise warmed her more than the harsh sun, and she found renewed energy to continue through the long afternoon. By evening, they had the cattle settled in a high mountain meadow with good grass and a clear stream. Graham showed Josephine how to make camp, and they worked together to set up a simple shelter, start a fire, and cook a basic supper of beans and bacon. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped sharply, they sat close to the fire wrapped in blankets, and Graham told her stories about his childhood and the adventures he had experienced in these mountains. Josephine shared memories of her own, and they talked long into the night, their voices quiet under the vast canopy of stars. When it was time to sleep, Graham spread his bedroll on one side of the fire and Josephine's on the other, maintaining the respectful distance he had promised. But Josephine found herself reluctant to retreat to her separate space. She had been watching Graham all day, noticing the strength and skill with which he handled the work, the gentleness he showed the animals, the patient way he explained things to her. She had been observing him for weeks now, and the respect and gratitude she felt had been gradually transforming into something warmer and more complex. "Graham," she said quietly, before she could lose her nerve. "I want to thank you again for giving me time, for not demanding things I was not ready for, but I think I am ready now, ready to truly be your wife in all ways if you still want that." Graham looked at her across the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames, and said, "I want that very much, Josephine, but are you certain? There is no rush. We have all the time we need." "I am certain," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You have shown me nothing but respect and kindness. You have made me feel valued and safe. I want to be close to you, not because I owe you, but because I want you." Graham stood and walked around the fire, then sat beside her and took her hand. "I want you too," he said quietly. "I have wanted you since I first saw you standing on that platform, refusing to cry while everyone else turned away. You are the bravest person I know, and I am honored that you chose me." He kissed her then, not on the forehead as he had at their wedding, but on her lips, a slow and gentle kiss that held both passion and tenderness. Josephine leaned into him, wrapping her arms around his neck, and kissed him back with all the longing and hope that had been building in her heart. They made love for the first time there under the stars, fumbling and awkward at first, but then finding a rhythm that felt natural and right. And afterwards, they lay together wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the fire burn down to embers. "I love you," Josephine whispered into the darkness, surprised to find the words true. "I do not know when it happened, but somewhere between herding cattle and churning butter and arguing about whether the barn needs a new roof, I fell in love with you." Graham's arms tightened around her. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I started loving you when you ordered that beef stew and told me about hitting a man with a fire poker to defend someone weaker. You are everything I never knew I needed." Josephine Taylor Reeves. They slept tangled together under the stars, and when they woke with the dawn, everything had changed and nothing had changed. They were still partners working together to build a life, but now they were also lovers who had chosen each other not from desperation, but from genuine affection and respect. The ride back to the ranch house the next day was slower, both of them sore and tired from the long hours of work, but Josephine had never been happier. She kept catching Graham's eye and finding him watching her with an expression of such contentment that it made her breath catch. When they reached home, Graham helped her down from her horse and said, "I am going to move my things into the main bedroom tonight, if that is acceptable to you." "Very acceptable," Josephine said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "In fact, I insist on it." The summer passed in a blur of hard work and deepening love. Josephine became increasingly capable with all aspects of ranch life, learning to deliver calves when complications arose, to repair fences and water tanks, to shoot a rifle accurately enough to protect the chickens from foxes and hawks. She also made the house increasingly comfortable, sewing quilts and rugs from scraps of fabric, planting flowers around the porch, and organizing the storage areas with meticulous efficiency. Graham continued to surprise her with small kindnesses, bringing her wildflowers from the meadows, carving her a set of wooden spoons when hers broke, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings to watch the sunset even when he was exhausted from the day's work. They talked about everything, sharing their thoughts and dreams and fears, and their physical intimacy deepened alongside their emotional connection. In September, they made the trip back to Silver Reef to collect supplies for winter and to attend the fall social at the church. Josephine wore one of her new dresses, and Graham wore his good suit, and they danced together in the church hall while the fiddle player kept time. Sarah Mitchell, who had given birth to a healthy son in August, pulled Josephine aside during a break and said, "You look completely transformed from the woman who arrived on the train. You are glowing." "I am happy," Josephine said simply. Happier than I ever thought I could be after my parents died. Graham has given me a home and a purpose, and somewhere along the way we fell in love. It shows, Sarah said warmly. You are both lucky to have found each other. As winter approached, Graham taught Josephine how to prepare the ranch for the harsh months ahead. They slaughtered a steer and preserved the meat. They banked the house with earth to keep out the cold wind. They stocked up on supplies that would see them through until spring. Josephine made endless preserves from the garden harvest and sewed warm quilts for their bed. The first snow came in November, and Josephine woke to a world transformed, white and pristine under a crystalline sky. She stood on the porch wrapped in her shawl and watched the cattle huddled in the lee of the hills, and felt a fierce pride that she had helped create this functioning ranch, this secure home. Graham came out to join her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her head. "Are you sorry you stayed?" he asked. "Are you lonely out here away from town and other people?" "I am not sorry for a single moment," Josephine said firmly, turning in his arms to look up at him. "I have everything I need right here. You, the ranch, the life we are building together. I am not lonely when I have you." By January, Josephine suspected she might be pregnant, though she waited another month to be sure before telling Graham. When she finally shared the news one evening over supper, Graham's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, fear, and then fierce protectiveness in rapid succession. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "When do you think the baby will come?" "I am as certain as I can be without seeing a doctor, and I think sometime in September," Josephine said. "Are you pleased?" Graham stood so abruptly that his chair nearly tipped over, then rounded the table and pulled her into his arms. "Pleased does not begin to cover it," he said into her hair. Terrified, overjoyed, honored, grateful, all of those things at once. "We are going to have a child, Josephine. A family." That winter seemed endless, with snow piling up until it reached the porch railings and temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the kitchen basin overnight despite the fire. But Josephine had never felt warmer or more secure. She and Graham spent long evenings planning for the baby, discussing names and making practical preparations. Graham built a cradle from pine wood and polished it until it gleamed, and Josephine sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric she ordered from the catalog. They talked seriously about the challenges ahead, acknowledging that childbirth was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and that they were miles from the nearest doctor. But Graham arranged for Sarah Mitchell, who had experience as a midwife, to come stay at the ranch when Josephine's time drew near, and they stocked up on supplies that might be needed. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted in rushing torrents, the grass turned green almost overnight, and the cattle grew fat on the new growth. Josephine's pregnancy progressed normally despite some expected discomforts, and Graham hovered over her with an attentiveness that was both touching and occasionally exasperating. "I am not made of glass," she told him firmly when he tried to stop her from weeding the garden in May. "Women have been having babies and working right up until delivery since the beginning of time. I will not break from pulling a few weeds." But she appreciated his concern, even when it was excessive, because it came from love rather than any desire to control her. Graham supported her independence while still making sure she knew she did not have to shoulder every burden alone. In late August, 2 weeks before Josephine's expected due date, Sarah Mitchell arrived at the ranch to stay until after the birth. She was a cheerful, practical woman who took over the kitchen with efficient competence and kept both Josephine and Graham calm during the waiting period. The labor began on a cool September evening, just as the sun was setting over the western hills. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following day, and there were moments when Josephine was certain she would not survive it. But Sarah was calm and experienced, coaching her through each contraction, and Graham stayed nearby, holding her hand and offering water and words of encouragement. Finally, as afternoon light slanted through the bedroom windows, their son was born, howling his displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. Josephine held him against her chest, marveling at his tiny perfect fingers and the dark hair plastered to his small head, and felt love so intense it was almost painful wash through her. "He is perfect," Graham whispered, tears streaming unabashed down his weathered face. "You are perfect." "Thank you for this gift, Josephine. Thank you for giving me everything." They named him Gabriel Thomas Reeves, combining Graham's initial with Josephine's grandmother's maiden name, and he was a healthy, vigorous baby who quickly established his own particular personality. Graham was a devoted father from the first moment, rising in the night to bring Gabriel to Josephine for feeding, walking the floor with his son when the baby was fussy, and staring at the child with an expression of wonder that made Josephine fall even more deeply in love with her husband. Sarah stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, helping Josephine recover and teaching her the practical skills of caring for a newborn. When she finally returned to her own family, she hugged Josephine tightly and said, "You have built a beautiful life here. That baby is lucky to have you both as parents." The first year of Gabriel's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. Josephine learned to balance caring for an infant with maintaining the household and helping Graham with the ranch work when possible. Graham was endlessly patient with the disruptions a baby brought, never complaining when Josephine was too tired for anything beyond basic necessities, always ready to take over baby care so she could rest. They made their life work through compromise and communication, through respecting each other's needs and sharing the burdens equally. It was not always easy, and there were days when Josephine was so exhausted she could barely remember her own name, but she was never unhappy. Every time she looked at Gabriel's sweet face or caught Graham watching their son with that expression of awe, she felt grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together. By Gabriel's second birthday in September of 1880, the ranch was thriving. Graham had expanded the horse herd with the loan he had taken from the bank, and the breeding program was starting to pay off with high-quality animals that sold for premium prices. Josephine's garden had become famous among their neighbors for its productivity, and she had started selling her surplus vegetables and preserves at the general store in Silver Reef for extra money. They had also become active members of the small but growing community, hosting occasional gatherings at the ranch and attending church regularly in town. Josephine had formed real friendships with Sarah Mitchell and several other women, creating a support network that made the isolation of ranch life more bearable. On a cool October evening, with Gabriel asleep in his cradle and supper dishes washed, Josephine and Graham sat together on the porch wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars emerge overhead. "You ever think about that day you arrived in Silver Reef?" Graham asked quietly. "About how close we came to never meeting?" "I think about it sometimes," Josephine admitted. "About how desperate I was, how certain I was that I would never be anything other than alone and afraid. And then you appeared and saw something in me that no one else did." "I saw the truth," Graham said simply. "I saw a woman brave enough to cross a continent on her own, strong enough to face rejection without breaking, and honest enough to tell me about her flaws before I asked. I saw exactly what I needed, even if I had not known I needed it until that moment." Josephine turned in his arms to kiss him, a slow, sweet kiss that held 3 years of partnership and love. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love this life we have built. I love our son and our home and the future we are creating together. Thank you for choosing me when no one else would." "Thank you for choosing me back," Graham replied. "For seeing that I was offering something real and being brave enough to take the chance. You have given me everything I ever wanted and things I never knew to want. You are my partner, my love, and my best friend, and I am grateful every single day that the train brought you to Silver Reef." They sat together under the vast Utah sky, holding each other close, while inside their stone house, their son slept peacefully in the home they had created through hard work and love and unwavering commitment to each other. Josephine thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, arriving in Silver Reef with nothing but bruises and broken dreams, and marveled at the transformation that love and partnership had wrought. She was no longer the unwanted bride nobody had wanted. She was Josephine Reeves, rancher's wife, mother, and equal partner in a life that was hard but deeply satisfying. She had found her place in the world, not through beauty or accomplishments or any of the things society said mattered, but through courage and determination, and the extraordinary luck of finding a man who valued those qualities above all others. As the years passed, the Reeves Ranch continued to grow and prosper. Gabriel was joined by a sister, Lily, in 1882, and another son, Samuel, in 1885. Each child was loved fiercely and raised with the values of hard work, honesty, and respect that Graham and Josephine held dear. The children grew up strong and capable, learning to ride before they could properly walk, absorbing the rhythms of ranch life as naturally as breathing. Graham built additions onto the house as the family expanded, turning the simple stone structure into a sprawling home with enough bedrooms for everyone, and a large common room where they gathered for meals and evening activities. Josephine taught her children to read and write, using the books they ordered from catalogs and treasured like gold, while Graham taught them about animals and land management, and the importance of being good stewards of the earth. The ranch itself became one of the most successful operations in the region, known for producing high-quality horses and cattle, and managed with progressive methods that other ranchers came to study and emulate. Graham's reputation for honesty and fair dealing meant that buyers sought him out, willing to pay premium prices for animals bearing the Reeves brand. Josephine became a respected figure in the community as well, known for her generosity with both produce and advice, her skill at midwifery that she had learned from Sarah Mitchell, and used to help other women through difficult births, and her fierce advocacy for the small school that was established in Silver Reef in 1883. She served on the school board and fought successfully to ensure that girls received the same education as boys, drawing on her own experiences of how education had saved her. They faced challenges over the years, of course. There was the drought of 1886 that killed half their cattle and nearly broke them financially. The winter of 1887 that was so brutal that they lost all of their chickens and 2 horses to the cold. The bout of scarlet fever that swept through the region in 1889 and nearly took Lily from them, leaving Josephine sitting up night after night bathing her daughter's fevered body and praying desperately for her survival. But they faced every challenge together, supporting each other through the dark times and celebrating the victories with equal intensity. Their partnership, forged in those early days when they were strangers taking a chance on each other, only deepened with time. They developed the kind of wordless communication that long-married couples sometimes achieve, where a glance across a room could convey whole conversations, where each instinctively knew what the other needed before words were spoken. Graham never lost his habit of bringing Josephine wildflowers from the meadows, even after 20 years of marriage, and Josephine never stopped leaving small notes in his lunch pail when he went out to work, little messages of love and appreciation that he collected in a box he kept in his dresser. They maintained a policy of never going to sleep angry with each other, talking through disagreements even when they were both exhausted. And they protected their relationship by making time for just the two of them, even as the demands of ranch and family consumed their days. On their 20th wedding anniversary in July of 1898, Graham surprised Josephine by taking her on a week-long trip to Salt Lake City, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of their oldest son Gabriel, who at 19 was already proving himself to be an excellent rancher. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, attended a performance at the theater, and wandered the city streets hand in hand like young lovers. On their last evening in the city, as they walked through a park in the gathering dusk, Graham stopped and pulled Josephine into his arms. 20 years ago, I saw you standing on that train platform and I knew, he said quietly. I knew you were special, that you were what I needed, even though I could not have explained how or why. Every day since then has proven me right. You are the best decision I ever made, Josephine Reeves. Josephine looked up at this man who had chosen her when no one else would, who had seen value in her when she could barely see it in herself, and felt her heart swell with love that had only grown deeper with time. And you are mine, she said. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible, Graham. You gave me a home and a family, and most importantly, you gave me yourself. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. They kissed in the twilight of that Salt Lake City park, and passers-by smiled at the sight of two middle-aged people so clearly still in love, so comfortable with each other, yet still passionate. They returned to the ranch refreshed and reconnected, ready to face the new century that was rapidly approaching. Gabriel was making plans to marry his sweetheart, a teacher named Emma who had moved to Silver Reef 2 years earlier, and Graham was already discussing building them a small house on the edge of the ranch property so the young couple could start their own life while still being close to family. Lily, now 16, was showing a remarkable talent for training horses and was talking about expanding that part of the ranch business. Samuel, 13 and full of energy, was more interested in the cattle operation and could often be found studying the breeding records and making suggestions about which bulls to keep and which to sell. Josephine looked at her family gathered around the dinner table one Sunday evening in early 1899 and felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. She had come to Utah Territory as a desperate, rejected woman with nothing but bruises and broken dreams. Through courage, hard work, and the love of a good man, she had built a life that was rich in everything that truly mattered. The ranch would continue for generations, she thought, passed down from parents to children, each generation adding their own contributions and improvements. The Reeves name would mean something in this part of Utah, would be synonymous with integrity and quality, and the kind of stubborn determination that had built the West. And it had all started because one man had looked past the surface and seen the truth beneath, because Graham Reeves had said that the bride nobody wanted was exactly who he had been seeking. As the years continued to roll forward, Graham and Josephine gradually passed more of the daily ranch operations to their children, though neither ever fully retired. Graham, at 65, still rode out every morning to check the herds, though he returned earlier than he used to and spent more time supervising than doing the heavy work himself. Josephine, at 62, still maintained her massive garden and oversaw the household, though she had help now from daughters-in-law and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. They had been blessed with 7 grandchildren by 1910, with more on the way, and their stone house rang with the sounds of family gatherings every Sunday after church. Graham had built a long table that could seat 20 people, and it was always full of children and grandchildren and occasionally neighbors who had become like family over the decades. On quiet evenings, when the grandchildren had gone home and the house was peaceful, Josephine and Graham would sit together on the porch they had sat on for more than 30 years, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the Utah landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about the past, remembering the early days when everything was uncertain and difficult, but also fresh and exciting. Sometimes they talked about the future, about which grandchildren seemed likely to carry on the ranching tradition and which would forge their own paths elsewhere. But mostly they simply sat together in comfortable silence, secure in the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, all the complex messiness of building a life together. Graham passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1915, at the age of 63, his hand clasped in Josephine's. He had been suffering from a weak heart for several months, and they had both known the end was approaching. On his last evening, they sat on their porch one final time, watching the sunset together, and Graham said quietly, "I have no regrets, Josephine. You gave me everything I needed and more than I deserved. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago." "Thank you for asking," Josephine replied, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Josephine grieved deeply for the loss of her partner, but she was sustained by the memories of their decades together and by the family they had created. She continued to live at the ranch, surrounded by children and grandchildren who visited constantly, bringing life and noise and love into the stone house that Graham had built. She lived another 12 years, dying peacefully at the age of 74 in the autumn of 1927, surrounded by her 3 children and most of her grandchildren. Her last words were to Gabriel, who had become as fine a rancher as his father, and she told him, "Take care of this place. Your father and I built it from nothing through love and hard work, and it represents everything we believed in. Pass those values on to your children." Gabriel buried his mother next to his father in the small family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could rest together under the Utah sky they had loved. At the funeral, he spoke about his parents' remarkable love story, about how his mother had arrived in Silver Reef as an unwanted bride and had built a life that became a testament to courage and partnership, and the transformative power of being truly seen and valued. The Reeves Ranch continued to thrive for generations, and the story of Graham and Josephine became family legend, told to each new generation of children as an example of what real love looked like. It was not the sanitized romance of dime novels, but something better and more real. 2 people who chose each other deliberately, who worked together through everything life threw at them, and who built something meaningful that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. And it had all begun on a hot July day in 1878, when a cowboy looked at a rejected bride and said the words that changed both their lives forever. "Then she is exactly who I have been seeking."